Hello, everybody. Today, we are going to talk about some non Wild related news, but instead news that relates to not one but two Central Division rivals. Mikko Rantanen has been traded to the Carolina Hurricanes for Martin Necas, Jack Drury, a 2025 second round pick, and a 2026 fourth round pick. In that same three-team trade, Carolina also acquired former Hart Trophy winner Taylor Hall from Chicago, who also retained half of Rantanen's contract for Chicago's own 2025 third-round pick. This trade did break at night last Friday, but there are some really interesting pieces of info that came out over the weekend regarding Rantanen's feelings on the deal and how close he felt he and the Avs actually were to striking a new contract that I felt really kind of should play into a breakdown of this trade. So, what did each team get from this deal? Let's break it down. So let's start off here with the Chicago Blackhawks. They gave up Taylor Hall in this trade, and coming into this season, Hall was viewed as kind of a likely deadline rental for Chicago. He's in the final year of his 4-year, $6 million year deal he signed with Boston. But rumors were initially that they likely could have gotten a second or even a late first for him if they retained and traded him at the deadline. However, Elliot Friedman did report after this trade broke that his value was actually less than a third round pick going into the deal. If that's the case, I think I would have rather re signed him and kept him to mentor Connor Bedard. They did get their own third round pick back, so it is a little bit of a higher one, but I think it's still well under what they could have gotten had they played their cards right. So, the main reason I'm not a very big fan of Taylor Hall being included in this deal was because of the role he served as a mentor for Connor Bedard on this Blackhawks roster. Here, Tracy Myers reports that Bedard is quoted as saying that Taylor Hall was always giving me advice or there for questions or whatever. I ended up becoming pretty close to him. And here, Phil Thompson is reported Taylor Hall was actually interested in re signing with the Blackhawks for more years to come. However, it kind of seems like the breaking point for the organization was that now, under two different head coaches, he was getting relegated to either being healthy scratched under their former coach in Luke Richardson or being relegated to the fourth line by their current interim Anders Sorensen. And so I think that the gist of the trade here for Chicago is that poor lineup construction with their most valuable trade deadline asset coming into this season resulted in a very underwhelming return. They didn't clear up much money. All they did was deal out Hall's $6 million, but pulled in a little over 4.5, retaining on Mikko Rantanen's contract. And they only got a third round pick for both. And so I think if you look at these lines here, if Taylor Hall is playing down here on your bottom line, reminder that Taylor Hall did have 24 points in 46 games for the Chicago Blackhawks. So he was one of their better forwards on their fourth line and getting healthy scratched. And so you look at their top six there, I can immediately see three players that I would likely bump in exchange for putting Taylor Hall in that top six to play with, especially on that top line to play with Connor Bedard. I don't think Tyler Bertuzzi really has any reason to stay up there. I think Frank Nazar, I get that they're trying to develop him. They're trying to play him there with Bedard. I think you could start him a bit lower down the lineup if it means that you can play a huge mentor for Bedard right next to him on the wing. I also think that you could bump Ilya Mikheyev a little bit farther down the lineup. He has not played the best this year in a top six role. I think you could knock him down a little bit if it means playing Taylor Hall higher up. And clearly, the Blackhawks are in a world of their own in this opinion that Taylor Hall is not a top six forward because the Hurricanes are already playing him in their top six. And so, in effect, Chicago gave up a top six forward and retained half of Mikko Rantanen's contract, and all they got was a third round pick out of the deal. And so I think that if Kyle Davidson isn't already on the hot seat in Chicago, I expect him to be there pretty soon. I think this is really bad asset management. I think this is a really poor return for what they gave up. And I think that if they're truly in the business of trying to make sure that Connor Bedard is happy and wants to be here long term, they need to put a better roster around him, and they probably should not be trading his mentor figures. So for this deal, I give Chicago a D. It would have been an F, but with Friedman reporting that Hall's value was actually a bit lower than what was being speculated, I decided to bump it up, but it's still not anything close to what I would have wanted or sought after if I was Kyle Davidson. So now let's jump over to the next Central Division rival here in the Colorado Avalanche. I think I understand the reasoning behind the pieces that the Avalanche traded for and kind of what they're getting out of this trade. I just don't necessarily like the urgency they seem to have with moving a franchise winger like Rantanen. I think their thought process was along the lines of you can't pay Rantanen and Cale Makar both 12 plus, certainly not 12 and a half plus million AAV, even with a significant cap jump that's being reported. If you look at the Avalanche's current cap situation, they're already looking a little bit strained, especially when you consider that Gabriel Landeskog is on LTIR. If you ever want your captain to play hockey for you again, you cannot pay Rantanen and Makar both these obscene amounts of money. They're both good players and I think deserving of it, but if you're the Colorado Avalanche, you can't pay both of them. Elliot Friedman did report that the internal McKinnon cap of that $12.6 million AAV that was applied to Rantanen's contract negotiations will not apply to Cale Makar because they know that they cannot get him for that number. And so I think that makes it even more pressing that they really needed to get Rantanen for as cheap as possible, and it just kind of seemed like they couldn't quite get there. Makar is also younger than Rantanen. He's currently 25. Rantanen's currently 28. He will be 26 or 27 at the end of his current contract. And so I think that locking him up for a little bit of a longer prime, if you're the Avs, makes a lot more sense. And it's a lot easier for the Avalanche to replace a top line winger like Rantanen than it is to replace the number one defender on their team and potentially the number one defender on the planet. And so I think keeping all of that in mind, the return isn't necessarily horrible. It's definitely less, though, than I expected when the trade rumors initially started up. So Martin Necas is a good player. In 51 games this year, he has 57 points. He's making $6.5 million, and he's just 26, but he is definitely a step down from Mikko Rantanen. The other roster player that got moved here is Jack Drury. I think he's really underrated as a center. He's great defensively. However, I think he just tops out at that bottom six center. It seems like the Avalanche are going to play him at 3C, and I think that works perfectly for them. He's not going to be a big point producer, but he's just going to be a very solid presence down the center of your ice. I think the draft capital they got of a second and a fourth is lower, mainly because Necas is on a massive breakout year. He's on pace for 92 points, but not getting a first rounder of any kind if you're the Colorado does really sting. And so I think that the Avs are trying to moneyball this trade a little bit. It does kind of seem like they're trying to get a little bit cheaper. Certainly this year, certainly next year compared to what Rantanen is making. You're getting a younger, cheaper winger who still is producing a lot, and you're also pulling in a nice bottom six piece to kind of fully round out your team in a way you couldn't do if you had just kept Mikko Rantanen. The main hole being left on the roster for Colorado is playoff production. Mikko Rantanen is one of the best playoff producers in the league. As you can see here, he is consistently above a point per game in the playoffs. Martin Necas is not. He is definitely a step down in these big playoff moments. We have here Chris McFarland, the GM of Colorado, was talking about the trade. He said, Martin Necas, he is in the top 10 in scoring this year. I think his age is a big part of that. He's pretty quick. He fits in with his speed. He's certainly a top 6 talent. Whether he has another bump in his game with the way we play, we will see. And I think that Jack Drury is hopefully that third line center that we've kind of been looking for. It's no secret that this trade will improve our depth. And so I think that kind of solidifies they know they're not able to trade and fully replicate Mikko Rantanen, but they're really betting on Necas taking that extra step now that he's in Colorado and maybe unlocking an extra element of his game, especially in the playoffs. So the really interesting thing here with this trade is what came out after it had finished, and that is Elliot Friedman reporting that the Avalanche were willing to make Rantanen the highest paid winger in the NHL, passing Artemi Panarin, but they were not willing to pay him more than McKinnon. That had already been widely reported. They were not willing to break that $12.6 million mark. However, the number floating around is 11.75 for 8 years. And that's the Avs' last contract offer before making this trade. And so I think that is probably honestly not far off from what Rantanen was likely looking for, because Rantanen, like right after the trade, talked to a Finnish newspaper, and he went on saying that he played in Colorado for almost 10 years and contributed a lot to the organization. We even won a championship. That's why this trade came as such a surprise. And in response to media speculation suggesting that Rantanen's salary demands were too high for Colorado, he said, "I don't think that's true. I don't want to talk exact numbers, but I was willing to take a significant cut below my market value. That's why this trade was such a shock to me." And so my best guess is that Rantanen's hard lower bound was $12 million. I think he was looking in that 12 to 12.5. It does not seem like he was trying to push over the 12.6 kind of hard McKinnon internal cap. It seems like he was very interested in working within that, but it seems like Colorado was not willing to cross the Rubicon of $12 million either. And so when he turned down 11.75, they just decided to jump on kind of the first really nice offer that came to their table, which happens to be this offer from the Carolina Hurricanes. And so I think overall, Colorado did get a little bit worse. I think that if you look at their depth, obviously Necas is there to replace Rantanen, which is a very tall task. I think their bottom six looks a little bit better now with Jack Drury, but you're betting on the unproven asset, and you're really betting that Necas takes this additional step that he hasn't yet. And if he does, you might be back to the same issue next season. Because if Necas does, let's say he does take this next step. Let's say he hits 100 points this year. He is able to perform well in the playoffs, and then he hits 100 points again next year. What is his extension number going to look like? Because he's only on a 2-year deal. You're probably still going to have to pay him a decent chunk of money. And then you're back to square one of trying to figure out how to pay him, while also seeing if you can keep Landeskog on your payroll. And I don't think the Avalanche have any desire to move on from Gabriel Landeskog in any way, shape, or form. So I think you are running the risk of being back in the same position next season. And so I think at the end of the day, this does feel a little bit like a panic move. I do understand, I think, the thought process for Chris McFarland behind dealing him. I just don't think it had to happen right now. I think you could have waited. You could have seen if he was willing to go under 12, and you could have kept negotiating. And so I think they just kind of jumped on this deal. They got offered a top 6 forward. They got offered a bottom 6 forward and a little bit of draft capital, and they just kind of jumped on it. So I'm going to give them a B-. I think they got a good haul, but it is not necessarily the most that they could have gotten had they waited a little bit, and they potentially could have re-signed Mikko Rantanen. And so that's where it's a little bit confusing. That's where that grade slips a little bit. Finally, we have arrived at who I think are the clear winners of this deal, which is the Carolina Hurricanes. I think it's hard to argue that they didn't come out on top. They gained a perennial 100-point player in Mikko Rantanen, who also happens to be national level teammates with your other current star forward, Sebastian Aho. So there's already some pre made chemistry there. You also net Taylor Hall, who's a former Hart winner, who can really kind of round out your middle six scoring. And you got both of them without giving up a first round pick. Natchez is a very good player. However, I don't think he will end up being Mikko Rantanen. I think he'll just be a very solid top line forward. And I think the short term deal they signed him to last offseason indicates that they weren't really sold on Natchez being a long term part of the Hurricanes. And so they've already begun contract extension discussions with Rantanen. And so it sounds like, if they're able to retain him, this is an absolute steal of a trade. It looks a little bit worse if you can't, but I think, yeah, if you can get Mikko Rantanen on your team long term to pair with Aho, that is a fantastic deal. I would also like to note that Eric Tulsky managed to acquire Jake Gensel last year at the trade deadline, also without giving up a first round pick. I think he's probably one of the best GMs in the league. I'm really happy that the Hurricanes have him. I think they're a really fun team to watch, and I'm really excited to see kind of the future of this team under Tulsky. The only downside of this trade is that it does leave Carolina thin at center. So obviously your top line guy is Sebastian Aho. Then you're jumping to Jesperi Kotkaniemi, who's been kind of up and down during his NHL career so far. Maybe pairing him with Svechnikov and Hall can help boost him a little bit. But then you're dropping to Jordan Staal, who has been pretty solid there on the third line. But then you're getting to that fourth line, and currently they're lined up with Juha Jaska. I think Jack Roslovic could slide over there and be your fourth line center, but he plays a little bit better as a wing. And so I do think the Hurricanes will continue to be aggressive there in the trade market, looking for another center. If not a top six guy, certainly somebody. It was reported that before they made this Rantanen deal, they did have some trade discussions with the Vancouver Canucks, both for Elias Pettersson and JT Miller. And it sounded like a trade for Pettersson would have required Martin Necas, but a trade for JT Miller would not have. And so that could still be a situation to keep your eye on. I don't know if they'll necessarily go for it. I think there's some cap issues that they'd have to work out both short and long term because Miller still has some term on his deal, and I don't think you can risk acquiring him if it means you can't re-sign Mikko Rantanen. But it's definitely still a situation that I would keep my eye on because if they can land JT Miller, I think this team quickly becomes my favorite to win the Cup this year. So I give them an A. I think they absolutely knocked it out of the park with this trade. I'm going to be watching the Hurricanes very intently, and I think currently they're probably my favorite out of the East. So what are your thoughts on the trade? How do you think each team did? Personally, I'm very happy that Mikko Rantanen is no longer in the Central Division. I think that really helps out the Minnesota Wild here for the remainder of the season. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed and want to see more, make sure to like and subscribe. Thank you.